So last week, Tyler introduced us to Samson, who is the epic judge of strength, but we also discovered a judge of some pretty epic fails. It seems to be the theme of our judges this summer is they tend to epic fail. He told you about some of Samson's emotional immaturity and how that contributed to some of his epic failing. And today we're going to continue to explore Samson and how he got to his most epic of epic fails. But before we dive into such a heavy topic, because no one likes to start church that way, I thought instead I would share with you my favorite epic fail video. And because it's me, it does have a cat. That gives me every time. So good. How fearlessly, how confidently, how absolutely does he just sail out that open window? Now, not being a cat, I have never epically failed quite to that level because A, I'm not small enough to fit through a window, and B, because I am not athletic enough to attempt to jump from any surface to any other surface. In my few forays into attempted athleticism, I have failed. And I'm going to share two of them with you in the spirit of honesty and vulnerability. All right, my first athletic attempt. The one and only sport I ever attempted in school was tennis. And that was my senior year of high school because it took all 12 years of school to work up the nerve to try and do a sport. So there were 12 spots on the girls' team, and I assume that only 12 of us tried out because I made the team. Now in tennis, you're ranked by your ability level in spots 1 through 12 because it's always good to know exactly how bad you are numerically. Number 1 was obviously the best, number 12 was the worst, and when you went to compete against another team, you played whoever had the same skill level as you. So the 1s played the 1s, the 2s played the 2s, so on and so forth. So in practice, every so often our numbers would shuffle based on how good or how bad you were doing. And I will let you know that I was a solid 12 from day 1 until the end of the season. I was a pretty epic failure at tennis. Okay, so my second, though earlier, athletic attempt was sometime roundabouts in middle school. So to set this up, for Christmas every year, we would go to my aunt's house out in the desert where my cousin Amber owned a golf cart. And it was glorious because me and my cousins were all too young to drive, but we were allowed to drive that golf cart. Naturally, shenanigans ensued, often involving FBI agents versus the criminals, with one chasing the other, and much reckless driving of said golf cart. Now, at one point, I was riding on the back of the golf cart, because that's a good idea, where you're supposed to strap the clubs, with my cousin Kayla. And little beknownst to our drivers, we had secretly converted to the criminal side and were undercover. But now it was time to make our grand escape. Now, golf carts don't go super fast, and Kayla's plan was that we would simply step off the back and make our secret escape before the drivers turned around and noticed that we were not hanging onto the back anymore. Now, this worked really great for Kayla because she, unlike me, was very athletic. She played softball and gymnastics and basketball and was very good at all of these things. So she simply stepped off the back of the moving golf cart and was fine. Now, emboldened by her success, I attempted to also gracefully disembark the moving golf cart. However, I panicked halfway through, and though my feet left the golf cart, my hand convulsively clutched the railing to which I was holding. And I proceeded to be dragged for about 30 feet before I finally let go. Now, this is not a difficult maneuver to pull off, but I ethically failed at jumping off a barely moving golf cart. And I now have a permanent scar on my knee as a memento to this particular epic fail, because everyone wants to remember that. Now, in my deep athletic shame, I certainly view these as highly epic fails. I suppose that in the grand scheme of things that I could potentially fail at in life, these probably barely even register as noteworthy. There are a lot more important and significant things in life that I could fail at, and those would probably be the true epic fails. Samson, for instance, failed epically. He didn't just miss a skateboard jump or fail to land a backflip or get dragged behind a golf cart. He betrayed God and the people he was entrusted to care for, and before he knew it, instead of being the righteous judge of Israel, full of God's favor and blessing, protector from the Philistines, he found himself enmeshed in sin, captured by the Philistines, had his eyes gouged out, and lived out the rest of his days as their prisoner grinding grain. This is a pretty epic fail. Samson was called to be so much more, to follow and serve God with his life, but he ended up epically failing. Are you in danger of an epic fail? Are you maybe on the path to a failure of epic proportions? Maybe it's the inappropriate fantasies about your coworker that could lead down the road to an affair. Maybe it's those 2 extra beers at night that could lead down the road to alcoholism. Maybe it's the couple extra clicks on that incognito website that could lead down the road to a porn addiction. Maybe it's those missing pencils at work, those fudged finance files that could lead down the road to corporate fraud. Maybe it's those angry lash outs that could lead down the road to abuse. Maybe it's that extra hour on Facebook or those 7 YouTube videos later that could lead down the road to failing out of school. But some of the most dangerous epic fails are when you wake up one day and suddenly realize that you are miles away from where you intended to be. When you're in a place that you never thought it was possible to get to. When you don't recognize who you are or what you're doing. Because no one wakes up one day and thinks, you know what? I'm going to fail epically today. I'm going to cheat on my husband. I'm going to solicit someone online for sex. I'm going to steal from my company and commit corporate fraud. I'm going to hit my kid. I'm going to drive drunk. I'm going to fail out of college. I'm going to have no friends. I'm going to hate my dad. I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to not know God and not follow him and live like I don't believe he's real. This doesn't happen. You don't just wake up one day and decide to epic fail out of the blue. You don't epic fail just by accident or by happenstance, because epic failures always begin with small steps that take you from here to there, from this place to where you never thought you could be in a million years. That's what happened to Samson. He didn't just wake up one day and say, you know what? Today I'm going to epically fail and get myself caught by the Philistines and have my eyes gouged out. No one does that. But what he did do was take a series of small steps that took him from here to there, from this place to where he never thought he could be. And unless we guard the small steps that we take here and now, we may find ourselves in a place that we never thought we could be in a million years, completely, epically failing. So, how did Samson go from here to there? Let's take a look at the very beginning, before Samson was even on the radar. Samson's birth was foretold to his parents by an angel of the Lord who said this to Samson's mom. You will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and his hair must never be cut, for he will be dedicated to God as a Nazirite from birth. He will begin to rescue Israel from the Philistines. So, even before he is born, even before he is conceived, Samson's life is already dedicated to God. Now, Samson was set apart in a very particular way, which is fulfilling the vow of a Nazirite. But each of us are equally made to live lives joined together to God, living lives that are connected deeply to him, even if we haven't taken a Nazirite vow. And the Bible continues to tell us that Samson walked with God for at least a time. When her son was born, she named him Samson, and the Lord blessed him as he grew up. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him while he lived in Mahanadan, which is located between the towns of Zorah and Eshtaol. Samson is here. He is living a life connected to God and following him, abiding by the rules that God has set in place for him, fulfilling his vow as a Nazirite. When have you been here? A good place, a place close to God where you're connected to him and following his will? Are you here right now? Are you in a place where you're closely and deeply connected to God and following him? Samson is here right now. So how does everything end up epically failing? How does Samson get from here, a place that is so right and so good, to there, a place that is so wrong and so out of sync with God's plan for him? Well, just like any journey, it starts with just one small step. How did Samson epic fail? First, by taking just one small step. Let's take a look at chapter 14, where one day everything changes. One day, when Samson was in Timnah, one of the Philistine women caught his eye. That's pretty sassy stuff, huh? Those Philistine women catching your eyes. Well, this seems like the start of some epic sin right here, right? Getting caught by a Philistine woman in your eye. That's a weird sentence. I don't think this seems like the start of a pretty epic sin. You might be like, Megan, I thought there'd be something a little more shocking and more profound as he takes this first small step. Maybe it should read, one day when Samson was in Timnah, he got in a fight and murdered a guy. That seems like the start to an epic fail. Or one day when Samson was in Timnah, he kicked a dog and stole soup from a blind kid. That also seems like the start to a pretty epic fail, right? Sorry. Those sorts of things you think would be the start to an epic fail, stealing soup and kicking blind kids. But just looking at a girl, that's the start of Samson's epic fail? Well, yes, because this tiny step, though maybe not outright sinful, begins to turn Samson's heart down a path that takes him from here to there. And what starts as just a look, a little bit of a lingering gaze on a pretty girl, turns into desire, which turns into a plan, which results in moving forward with a decision that was against God's law. So after looking at this Philistine woman, Samson goes to his parents and says, I want to marry this girl. Get her for me. And his parents do, and they get married, which doesn't seem so bad in the big scheme of things. Samson could have done a lot worse than marrying a girl he was attracted to, right? But this, again, is a small step away from God, away from what God wanted and intended for Samson, because God had already made clear that this step was not okay. In Deuteronomy 7:3-4, God says, you must not intermarry with them. Do not let your daughters and sons marry their sons and daughters, for they will lead your children away from me to worship other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and he will quickly destroy you. Now, the Israelite people are really, really bad at obeying God in this particular area because, hey, they look and they like what they see and they want to have what they see. And at the beginning of the book of Judges, we continue to see that this is an issue in general for the Israelite people, where they continue to take that small step outside of the boundaries and safeguards that God has set up for him. In Judges 3, we read, so the people of Israel lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, and they intermarried with them. Israelite sons married their daughters, and Israelite daughters were given in marriage to their sons, and the Israelites served their gods. The Israelites are directly disobeying what God had asked them not to do, and they are finding that the consequences God foretold are also happening. God told them not to intermarry with the Philistines because they will lead you away from me to worship other gods. And Judges tells us that this is exactly what happens, and the Israelites served their gods. This one small step of looking at a girl and wanting her led Samson down a path of beginning to walk away from God. It didn't start with some huge epic failure out of the blue. It started with just looking when he shouldn't have been looking. With this one small step, Samson begins to move from here, the good place, a place totally in line with God's will and direction, towards there, a place far away from God, a place of sin, and a place of epic failure. But Samson hasn't gotten his eyes gouged out yet. He just got married to a girl he shouldn't have. So how does Samson epic fail? Well, first, by taking that one small step, looking at a girl lustfully that he never should have been looking at, and then ending up marrying her. And then second, Samson epic fails by returning to that path he started on over and over again. Now, once you take a step in a particular direction, it becomes easier to take that step again. Once you take that first drink, it's easier to take another. Once you cross that line physically with your boyfriend or girlfriend, it's easier to cross it again. Once you steal a little bit, it's easier to steal a little more. Once you lie about a small thing, it's easier to lie about another thing. Samson has already taken one small step into an area God did not want him to go. So it's easier to go back again and to take another step. So when we pick up the story later, Samson's Philistine's wife has died, but now that he has already crossed that line of being with a woman that he should not be with, that God had expressly forbidden him to be with, it is easier to cross that line again and take another little step down that path. Judges 16 tells us, one day, Samson went to the Philistine town of Gaza and spent the night there with a prostitute. The first time Samson lusted after a girl he wasn't supposed to, he at least married her first. But the second time, he went looking for trouble. Now, the town of Gaza is 25 miles from Samson's hometown, Zorah. In this day and age, there are no cars, there's no bicycles, you have to walk. So that's 56,250 steps from home to a place that he should not be at all. Because Gaza is the capital city of the Philistines, the pagan nation that Samson is supposed to be helping protect the Israelites from, not going and hanging out with. That's 56,250 intentional steps away from here, a place with God, to there, a place where he's looking for trouble. The first time Samson took a small step away from God, he never dreamed of going all the way to Gaza. He just took a small step outside of his hometown to a nearby Philistine city and got with a girl. But once he'd taken that first step, it was easier to return to that path again and take another step. And instead of learning from his mistake the first time and turning back around, Samson kept returning to where he was not supposed to be and found himself drifting further and further from here, 56,250 steps away from here. When you keep returning to that same old little sin, you may find yourself accidentally taking 56,250 steps to a place that you didn't want to be. And even after going to Gaza and sleeping with a prostitute, Samson keeps returning to that same path. Judges 16:4 tells us, sometime later, Samson fell in love with a woman named Delilah, who lived in the valley of Sorek. And what do you guys think Delilah was? A God-fearing, righteous, wife-material Israelite? No. She was a Philistine, just like the other women he's been pursuing. Another woman that God has expressly forbidden Samson from being with. And he keeps going back to her again and again and again, even when it's clear that she doesn't love him, that she'll betray him, and that she's using him. But once you take that first step, it's easier to take the next step. Instead of recognizing that his first step was in the wrong direction, Samson keeps returning to that same old path, and the Bible tells us that this is folly. Once you know that something is wrong, we're supposed to run from it as fast as possible in the opposite direction, not keep returning to it. 1 Corinthians tells us run from sexual sin. 2 Timothy says run from anything that stimulates youthful lusts. 1 Corinthians says, so my dear friends, flee from the worship of idols. 1 Timothy 6 says, but you, Timothy, are a man of God, so run from all these evil things. We're not told to take a step back, look at it inquisitively, maybe circle around and look at it this way, come closer, look at it this way. We are told to run from it. Get away as fast as possible from sin. Run hard in the opposite direction. Put as much distance between you and that sin as possible. Flee, actively turn away. Put speed and distance between you and that sin. But instead of recognizing that he took one small step towards sin and away from God, Samson just keeps returning to that path and takes another small step and another small step. He doesn't run away from sin. He comes right back and sniffs it and takes that second small step. Proverbs 26:11 says, as a dog returns to his vomit, so a fool repeats his folly. Once you take that first step, it's easier to take the next. Maybe you're thinking, well, nothing too bad happened the first time I did it. Maybe it's not so bad. Maybe it won't hurt if I do it just one more time. I already said yes before. I already did this with my last boyfriend. No one caught me looking at porn last time. It was just one drink and I didn't get drunk. I was only a little bit angry at her. No one seemed to catch when I fudged the numbers before. I only missed one class. Nothing horrible happened when I didn't pray yesterday. Me and God will get back to it later. Once you take that first step, it's easier to take the next step. And your new normal is, yeah, I sleep with guys. Or yeah, I have a few drinks. Or yeah, I fudge the books a little. And now the next step isn't so big of a leap to take. And Samson found this to be true. Yeah, I've already married one Philistine woman. It wasn't so bad. Guess I'll sleep with a Philistine prostitute. That wasn't so bad. Guess now I'll move in and live with this other Philistine woman. And the problem with not running from sin, from not immediately fleeing after our first step in the wrong direction, is that the sin gets easier and easier to fall into, and the less and less you begin to recognize it as sin. Maybe at one point you felt bad about that first step that you took. But when you keep returning down that path, the Bible tells us how repeated sin dulls our sense of what is right and wrong. Romans 1:18 says, "But God shows his anger from heaven against all sinful, wicked people who suppress the truth by their wickedness." Repeatedly taking those small steps, repeatedly turning down the path, eventually begins to suppress the truth. The direction we are going is wrong. That what we are doing is not what God would want us to be doing. And Samson continues down the path of epic failure. How did Samson epic fail? First, by taking one small step. Second, by returning to that path over and over. And last, by believing in his own strength. During his first disastrous marriage to the Philistine woman, Samson got out of it by relying on his own strength. He slaughtered a bunch of people single-handedly, and there was no doubt that he had the strength enough to do it. His first small step didn't seem to have too many repercussions because he was able to get out of it based on his own skills and talents. And when he returns down the path and goes to sleep with the prostitute, Samson again feels confident in his ability to avoid the downfall of sin by his own strength. Judges 16, so this is right after he's gone to sleep with the prostitute. Word soon spread that Samson was there, so the men of Gaza gathered together and waited all night at the town gates. They kept quiet during the night, saying to themselves, "When the light of morning comes, we will kill him." But Samson stayed in bed only until midnight. Then he got up, took hold of the doors of the town gate, including the two posts, and lifted them up, bar and all. He put them on his shoulders and carried them all the way to the top of the hill across from Hebron. So there is no doubt that Samson is a strong guy. Have you ever tried to lift the doors of a fortified city? I haven't, because I'm not an athletic person, as I've already established. I've never tried to lift anything heavier than like the hospitality tub on Sunday. But I'm sure that these doors are incredibly heavy because they're supposed to stop things like battering rams and such. But Samson picks up these plus the doorposts and sneaks right out of the city under the noses of the people who want to kill him. Samson has strength. There is no denying that. And Samson knows it. He feels confident in his strength and his ability to flirt with fire without getting burned, because he can stay a step ahead of the Philistines. He walked right into their capital city and spent the night with a prostitute, but he can have his cake and eat it too. Maybe he shouldn't be doing this. Maybe it isn't wise. But last time he took that small step, he was able to get out of it fine. He's strong. He's got this. He knows how to stay safe and keep from getting entangled. Samson believes that he is in control of the situation. He knows he's in a dangerous spot. He knows where he's not supposed to be, but he taunts the Philistines in sin, confident in his ability to evade any real harm. And after taking up with Delilah, he continues this dangerous game, relying on his own strength to save him each time. The rulers of the Philistines went to Delilah and said, "Entice Samson to tell you what makes him so strong and how he can be overpowered." So Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me what makes you so strong and what it would take to tie you up securely." Now, I don't want to know what sort of weird games these guys are playing, that Samson was okay with Delilah repeatedly tying him up. But Samson messes with her, and he tells her the wrong thing to tie him up with. And Delilah tries it. And then, weirdly enough, the Philistines suddenly show up. But Samson easily breaks out of it and escapes. He's invincible. So he returns again to her house and to their relationship, and she pouts, and she asks him to tell her the real way that he can be overpowered. Again, he lies, and again she tries it, and again, crazily enough, the Philistines show up out of nowhere, and Samson breaks the bonds and escapes. They did this little routine 3 whole times, Samson returning again and again to danger because, hey, nothing bad happened last time, right? And again relies on his own strength to evade any real harm. Because, if anybody can handle it, Samson can. But when you keep returning down a path and keep relying on your own strength, eventually you will epic fail. Judges 16 tells us, "Then Delilah pouted, 'How can you tell me I love you when you don't share your secrets with me? You've made fun of me 3 times now, and you still haven't told me what makes you so strong.' She tormented him with her nagging day after day until he was sick to death of it. Finally, Samson shared his secret with her. 'My hair has never been cut,' he confessed, 'for I was dedicated to God as a Nazirite from birth. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as anybody else.' Delilah realized that he had finally told her the truth, so she sent for the Philistine rulers. 'Come back one more time,' she said, 'for he has finally told me his secret.' So the Philistine rulers returned with the money in their hands, and Delilah lulled Samson to sleep with his head in her lap. And then she called in a man to shave off the 7 locks of his hair. In this way she began to bring him down, and his strength left him. Then she cried out, 'Samson, the Philistines have come to capture you.' Samson wakes up, and he thought, 'I will do as before and shake myself free.' But he didn't realize that the Lord had left him. So the Philistines captured him and gouged out his eyes. They took him to Gaza, where he was bound with bronze chain and forced to grind grain in the prison." This is a big, epic fail. Samson was so supremely confident in his own strength, so sure that he would be able to get out of whatever mess he flirted with without any real harm done, so sure that he could avoid the consequences of stepping into sin. He thought that his strength and his skills and abilities and wit would save him. But Judges 16 told us that when he woke up, he thought, "I will do as before and shake myself free," but he didn't realize that the Lord had left him. He finally epic failed. He finally made it from here to there, a place he never thought he could be in a million years. Do you believe that you are in control of your flirting with sin? Do you believe that you can make a line somewhere over there and not cross it? Do you believe that you can stop anytime you want to? That you're made of tougher stuff and can handle it? That you would be able to stop before anything got really bad? Are you confident in your ability to flirt with sin? To keep coming back to it, but ultimately avoiding any real consequences or lasting damage? Are you relying on your own strength? 1 Corinthians 10:12 says, "If you think you are standing strong, be careful not to fall." We are most susceptible to falling and failure when we believe that we cannot fall, when we are relying on our own strength to stay upright, when we believe, "I would never cross a certain line," that we would only ever go so far, that we can keep ourselves from doing anything really, truly terrible or horrible. This is called the Nazi principle. So people were outraged by the atrocities committed during the Holocaust and the depraved and inhumane ways that citizens of the German army treated the Jews and other social outcasts. And for good reason, because what they did was depraved and inhumane and an atrocity. And we like to think to ourselves, "I would never do that. I would never treat anybody that way. I would never be a Nazi." Those people must have been so desperately evil and sinful to do something like that, and I'm not like that. We distance ourselves from the possibility or thought that we could ever commit an epic failure and believe that we have the strength and moral fiber to keep from doing any big sin. I could never have an affair. I would never look at child porn. I would never kill someone drunk driving. I would never be a Nazi. But that 1 Corinthians verse continues. The temptations in your life are no different from what others experience. The Nazis didn't start out one day saying, you know what, today I'm going to torture and murder innocent people for no reason. It started with a small temptation way back here, a temptation towards not being kind to people, towards treating people not the way God would want you to, that every single one of us face. And it was taking that one small step back here, and then another small step, and then another small step, and then another small step, until they found themselves suddenly moving from here to there, doing things that they never thought in a million years that they would ever do. We find ourselves moving from a place where we think, I could never do that, to a place where I just did the unthinkable. Ryan has a friend from college who was arrested for soliciting an underage girl for sex online, and he spent several years in jail for it. This was a very normal guy. He wasn't a weirdo. He wasn't a psychopath. He wasn't some depraved human being. He was Ryan's friend. He was married and had a wife whom he loved very much and who loved him. He was even on staff at his church. And he didn't just wake up one day saying, you know what? Today I'm going to solicit an underage girl for sex online. That epic fail started many, many, many years ago with one small step, with maybe just one lustful look at a girl in his class, with just one more look, with a glance at the internet, with a habit of porn, with a search for more deviant porn, with the belief and foolish confidence in his own ability to handle it, to keep his porn addiction and his lustful fantasies in check, to be strong enough to stop it anytime he wanted. And by taking that first small step and continuing to return to that path over and over and believing in his own strength against the effects of sin, he found himself in a place that he never thought he could be in a million years. When you taunt danger, when you taunt sin, when you believe in your own strength to stand firm and to resist sin and to avoid the consequences of flirting with the devil, that is when you are most in danger of failing, of epic failing. But if, instead of trusting in your own power, you recognize your weakness and you acknowledge the danger of, you know what? I could if I continue down this path. I am totally capable of getting to a place that I don't want to be. I could end up soliciting an underage girl for sex. I could end up getting addicted to drugs. I could end up ruining my family or having an affair. If you acknowledge the truth of I could, then you have finally reached a place where you can embrace God's strength instead of your own, because you recognize that you don't have anywhere close enough to enough strength to avoid sin. Because left to your own strength and your own abilities, you will epic fail in the path of sin, because you are not strong enough to avoid it on your own. But if you're willing to recognize your weakness and reach out to God, he has more than enough strength for you, because that 1 Corinthians verse continues, and God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you are tempted, he will show you a way out so that you can endure. He will not allow it. He will show you a way out, not you. His strength is the only strength that can get you out. Samson believed that he was strong enough. He didn't recognize the horrible amount of danger that he was in, how far and deeply he had fallen into the trap of sin, how much he was taunting sin and scoffing at it, relying on his own strength that had got him through before. But even the strongest man ever to have lived was not strong enough. Because if we rely on our own strength, we will epic fail. How did Samson epic fail? First, by taking one small step. Second, by returning to that path. Last, by relying on his own strength. How do you epic fail? First, by taking one small step. Second, by returning to that path. And last, by relying on your own strength. Your temptation may be very different than Samson's. Samson struggled with continually pursuing unhealthy, not God-honoring relationships with women, though each have a unique struggle and area of sin in our lives that we are tempted to. Your one small step is probably not wanting to marry a Philistine girl, but we all have areas in our lives where we can be tempted to take small steps down a path from here to there, from a place with God to a place we never imagined we could be. So what can we do to avoid epic failing like Samson? Number one, identify your small steps. What are the small steps that you are currently tempted to take that are maybe not all that bad, but are probably not what God would want you to be doing? This is where we need to rely on the Holy Spirit's gentle conviction and correction in our hearts and be willing to listen to that still small voice that says, you know what, Megan, this isn't quite right. This is probably not a good thing for you to be doing. God speaks to us through our consciences and through the Holy Spirit to guide us away from sin and back to him. But we have to be willing to listen because God does not shout, he whispers. For me personally, I always know it's the Holy Spirit guiding me away from a bad small step when I feel just that little bit of disquiet in the back of my mind, when I feel that little tug of guiltiness. And another metric that I use to judge whether or not this small step is totally okay is if I'm okay telling Ryan about it. He's someone I trust, who knows me very well, and who I love very much. And if I'm thinking about hiding a small step that I want to take from him, it's probably not a small step I should be taking. If I'm having a conversation with a guy right now, am I totally okay if Ryan knows about it? Or is there a part of me that wants him to not know about this particular conversation? If I feel that way, I probably shouldn't be taking that small step. As much as possible, identify what your temptations to a first step are. And then second, I want you to write down all the potential consequences of going down that road. Identify the consequences of sin. Maybe my first step is not so innocently watching an episode of a show that I know is potentially dangerous for me. What are all of the potential long-term consequences if I keep returning to that path? First, I watch the show, and then maybe I get a little sexually aroused. Then I watch another episode of that show in the hopes of continuing to be titillated. Maybe I start looking for images on the internet after completing the season. Maybe I start to watch porn. Maybe I begin to sexually objectify my friends. Maybe I start seeking out even more deviant porn. Maybe I can't have a sexually satisfying relationship with my wife in the future. Maybe she finds out about it, and then there's intense hurt and relational pain between me and my future wife when she discovers that porn collection I've been hiding. Maybe I struggle for years trying to stop looking at porn. Maybe it ends in a divorce between me and my wife. Maybe I start dabbling in child porn. Maybe I end up sexually molesting my daughter. Maybe I go to jail. Obviously, not everything always ends up in the worst case scenario. There are many, many subsequent paths that a first small step can take. But the person who ends up in jail for sexually molesting his daughter didn't wake up one day and just decide, today out of the blue, I'd like to molest my 9-year-old. No one does that because it's a horrible thing to do. But this epic failure started way, way, way back here, a long, long time ago with just one small step. And if you identify the consequences of sin and the possible long-term ramifications of that action, it gives you a sense of the reality of that sin and the danger of taking that first step. So once you've identified your potential small steps and you play out their long-term consequences, third, don't believe in your own strength. Don't fall into the trap of thinking, but I would never do that. Don't fall into the trap of the Nazi principle, thinking that you could never do something so horrible. Now, before I had Roland, I didn't understand shaken baby syndrome. This is when people shake their child so hard that they give them brain damage. And I thought to myself, how can anyone shake a baby and give them brain damage? You must be a horrible person to do something like that. I thought I would never do that. I would never shake my baby so hard to give him brain damage. But then I had Roland. And then I understood a shadow of how people get from here to there. And I recognized that, yes, I could. If I continued to take these small steps in that direction, I could do that. And recognizing that I was not invincible, that I am just as broken and capable of doing very bad things as anyone else, gave me the humility to rely not on my own strength, but on God's strength. Recognizing that I could very easily fall into the trap of shaking Roland and giving him permanent brain damage, I was not foolish enough to rely on my own strength to keep from doing it. Instead, each time I found myself taking that small step of anger, of frustration, of exasperation with Roland, I immediately began praying and trusting wholly in God's strength, knowing that if I relied on my own strength as a human being, I would fail. And I knew the consequences of that first small step of anger, and I knew that it could potentially result in me hurting one of the most precious people in my life. So I wholly invited God into the process way back here at the very first small step, and I clung to him to backtrack off that path. If you find yourself taking those first steps down the road of sin, do not believe that you can avoid downfall. Do not rely on your own strength, your own abilities, your own cleverness to avoid the consequences of sin. Do not fool yourself into believing that you can handle it, that you can control yourself, that you can do it, because that's exactly where the enemy wants you, because you can't do it by yourself, and you will epic fail if you try to. When you find yourself taking a small step, walking along the path of destruction from here to there, surrender and cry out to God. When you acknowledge your weakness, that is when you can finally become strong. 2 Corinthians tells us, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. God's power is made perfect in you, in your weakness, not in your strength. He will be your strength. He will be the one to help you run and flee from the sin, but unless you recognize that you are weak, you won't turn to him for his strength. Samson epic failed, but we can hopefully avoid epic fails in our own lives by recognizing that each epic fail is made up of thousands and thousands of tiny little choices and tiny little steps that lead you from here to there, from a place with God to a place where you never thought you could be in a million years. If we recognize the importance of that first small step, if we recognize the foolishness of returning over and over to that same path, if we can recognize how weak we are in the face of sin and instead embrace God's strength instead of our own, we can avoid epic failing. And we can not only avoid epic failing, but we can also epically live. How do you live an epic life? The same way you avoid epic failing, by taking one small step towards God, not away from God. And by continuing to return to that path towards God, and by relying on his strength as you intentionally pursue him one step at a time, over and over and over. If you want to be closer to God, more loving, to have deep, abiding friendships, to love your spouse more, to feel fulfilled and peaceful, you simply have to take that first small step in the direction towards God, moving from here to even better. Let's pray. God, I thank you for the truth that you revealed to us through Samson's story. God, you know how weak we are and how strong temptation is in our lives and how much we fool ourselves into believing that we can handle it, Lord. But you are the only strength that is strong enough to save us from ourselves. Lord, please help us to honestly look at our lives and decide, where are those small steps? What are those small temptations that I am tempted to take? What would be the long-term consequences if I did take this step and then kept returning down that path, Lord? What is the place that I would never, ever want to be? And then help us to recognize that I could get there, that I am not strong enough to avoid getting there on my own. And Lord, help us turn back to you, to run to you, to rely on you to be our strength, because you will save us if we acknowledge our weakness, Lord. We love you so much. In Jesus' name, amen.